Hi, Sean. Oh, I guess, okay, is this working now? Let's see here.
He's saying hi to
Hold
everybody.
on. Huh. Okay, there we go. No, you're fine, honey. I just muted you. So, okay, so we are live. Okay, so now we are live officially at 100%. Sorry, I lied last time. Okay, so just wanted to launch it. Sorry, it gives us a little bit of trouble every once in a while, but we're good to go now. So just another 2 minutes. I'm gonna start muting everybody that is not Tony and Nicole, just so there's kind of less, it's an easier flow of things throughout the event. But everybody that's logged on so far, thank you so much for coming on. We're really, really excited for this, and we'll be starting here in actually 1 minute. Okay. Oh. It's a perfect thing to do on like a cold night like this, to be honest. I'm like freezing over here. So I'm glad that we're doing something fun on a cold, rainy night.
That's the mood.
Yeah. Awesome. That'll be good. Okay. All right. Hi to everybody that's coming in. If I haven't muted you, if you don't mind muting, we're just trying to keep things a little bit, like steady and flowing. But thank you for the people who have just come in. Super excited for this. And let me just make sure everything is good, and we'll get on ahead started. So let me just double check that. Super excited for this. Okay. Looks like it is. All right, awesome. Okay. So let me just do a little bit of organizing first. So before we get started, I'm just going to go over some details about tonight's event. Participants that are entering in, I have muted you. If you can stay muted throughout the event, that's, like I said, just kind of helps things go along a little bit more smoothly. Feel free, at the end of the event, we will have a Q&A section. So for people on Zoom, definitely go ahead and ask those questions in the chat section. For Facebook Live, those of us who are tuning into Facebook Live, please post the comments below in the comments section below the video. Towards the end of the event, I will be reading out those questions, and I will be asking the people that are speaking, just so it makes it a little bit easier for everybody involved. So thank you everybody for joining us tonight. Welcome to the Delta Heritage Center's second exhibition exchange. Tonight we will be exploring Hoodoo in West Tennessee with Tony Kale and Nicole Gregory. They will talk about the history of Hoodoo in West Tennessee, deconstruct some misconceptions, and give insight on the exhibition Hoodoo We Do, tracing the origins and practices of Hoodoo in West Tennessee. This exhibition is curated by Nicole Gregory with objects on loan from the West Tennessee Museum of Southern Hoodoo and History. So, okay. And a Q&A session will be held at the end of their talk for all participants who are asking questions to Tony or Nicole. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Tony and Nicole. Tony Kale is an ethnographer and writer. He holds a degree in cultural anthropology and has researched ethnic culture for more than 25 years. His work has taken him from voodoo ceremonies in New Orleans to Haitian botanicas in Harlem and spiritual churches in East Africa. He has lectured at more than 100 universities and public safety agencies. He has been featured on CNN, the History Channel, numerous radio, television, and printout outlets. A resident of Humboldt, Tennessee, Tony was raised in Memphis and calls it his second home. Nicole Gregory is a current graduate student at the University of Memphis, getting her master's in art history with a concentration in museum practices and a certification in museum studies. She is working as a curatorial intern with the as a curatorial intern for the West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center for the fall of 2020. Previous to this, Nicole holds a bachelor's degree in classic studies and archaeology. She has experience excavating on archaeological sites and in underwater archaeology. Her passion is in the ancient world and museum studies and practices. So I'm going to hand over the virtual mic and have Nicole and Tony take it away.
Hello, everybody. I just wanted to say that I'm very appreciative of you all coming to listen to us speak and letting me show you my exhibit, and to Tony to kind of express his experience with Hoodooism in the South. Basically, the next 30 or so minutes is going to be dedicated to Tony answering some questions and pretty much relaying some information from his experience on the history of Hoodooism in the West Tennessee area and in the South. He's been pretty much a keystone to my exhibit and getting information, basically because he's an enormous, huge supply of what is mostly a verbal and almost like something that you pass on when practice and verbal communication, not mostly written down. And he's got a lot of firsthand experience in doing this. So to start it off, Tony, I first just kind of like thank you personally. I would like to just say thank you for helping me with this exhibit. And also to kind of start off, my first question would be is in West Tennessee, especially in Memphis, I was surprised to see that there was such a rich history intertwined with Hoodooism. Can you explain Hoodooism in your experience, and as well as your unique twist that West Tennessee puts on its own brand of Hoodooism?
Sure. Thank you, Nicole, and thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure working with y'all and putting this together, because this, as the book's entitled, it is a secret history, because it's a history we don't hear a lot about of hoodoo in West Tennessee. The core of hoodoo here in West Tennessee begins in Africa. Hoodoo is sort of a collective term for a number of healing practices, a number of practices concerning love and luck and healing and spirituality. And hoodoo, from what we have here in the Mid-South, was brought with slaves, the men and women in Africa that were taken from their homes and brought to the New World. And once they came to the New World, they were forced to give up their traditional ways of being, whether it be spirituality or forms of healing. Many were placed on plantations here in the South. While on these plantations, many of the practitioners had to be covert. In fact, some academics will refer to this as the secret institution. If, let's say, a slave on a plantation became hurt, we know that plantations in many cases didn't have any kind of good medical care. And then when you get into the realm of spiritual aspects, hoodoo also not only addresses natural medical issues, but also spiritual aspects. How do I protect myself from this slave owner that's abusive and violent? How do I make sure my children are safe when they go out into the woods at night? So there's that element of spirituality. So what we have seen from the beginning is a very strong African presence, particularly in Memphis, and then branching out. And with this, we see the entire culture of practitioners that were commonly referred to as root workers, in some cases conjurers. And the culture grew, and it grew in the Mid-South like it did in many different areas of the U.S. As a means of survival. It wasn't just some sort of trickery or some sort of, just continually doing some kind of spell work. It was a mode of survival, and it's survived through the ages. It's amazing the historical aspects here in the Mid-South related to hoodoo that we have. It's a very, very deep, deep historical lineage.
Yeah, and that was something that the way when you go into the exhibit, you'll actually get a little bit of background on that. But I personally was almost flabbergasted that a lot of the urban centers that we know today were completely different when they first started sprouting up, and that was a lot of it was due to the African American culture, and hoodooism was like kind of like a commercial front that a lot of people offered on streets like Beale Street and things like that. But it's kind of fitting that we're talking about this around Halloween, because there's a kind of gimmickry that gets attached with hoodooism. So what are some of the negative connotations that are associated with hoodooism that you personally like have noticed during your research?
Well, since the beginning, hoodoo, and we know specifically in areas like Memphis, hoodoo was initially viewed, and unfortunately still is by some, as some sort of bizarre, aberrant, primitive behavior related to African traditional religions, and the core of it is the racism against African traditional religions. As slaves started to show this in society, there was this knee-jerk reaction that, oh, they're practicing voodoo, they're sacrificing children, we should fear someone who calls himself a traditional healer because they're obviously going to be doing some sort of criminal or deviant activity. Nothing could have been further from the truth. But we actually saw periods in history in Memphis and in the state of Tennessee in which police actually called for a war against hoodoo practitioners. And there were cases in which root workers in Midtown Memphis at one point were arrested. We found documented records where mojo bags and different sacred artifacts were taken and burned. You found a lot of practitioners being chastised in the public media. And you also saw this tying in of calling hoodoo voodoo. Now voodoo, which is what we kind of use to delineate between more Hollywood depictions of voodoo and true African traditional religion, is very different than hoodoo. Now, I like to say that they are branches on the same tree. They sprout from African traditional religion. However, voodoo is more of a codified religion as opposed to sort of a blanket term that may refer to healing, maybe not necessarily tied to religion, or some sort of spiritual work, not necessarily tied to a codified religion. That's not to say that it doesn't interweave with traditional African and African American religion, but that it's not, there's not specifically a priesthood or anything like that you might find in voodoo. And here in the South, it's amazing. We kept finding all these incidents, records of all these incidents involving the public media fear and all these depictions of hoodoo in the press as being some, there was a period in time where the paranoia ran that Memphis was going to become Little New Orleans. And at that time period, New Orleans was depicted in the press as being run over with voodoo practitioners and, all sorts of quasi, cannibalistic rites, and just all this horrible exploitation and bias against African traditional religion was real heavy in the press. And so that carried over into the Mid-South in relation to how people were perceiving hoodoo.
See, that was one thing that we were trying to like steer away from. It's so easy to get attached to like the Americanized, Hollywoodized idea of like what is hoodooism and stuff like that, because it kind of gives it the wow factor. But when people actually dig into the true history, it in itself is a beautiful and very enriched history.
Absolutely.
So to kind of branch back out into a more general area, so as a folklorist, can you tell me like what made you want to become a folklorist, and what kind of made you focus your research on like spirituality, or maybe even specifically Hoodooism in the South area?
Sure. Well, my background in anthropology came from exposure to a anthropologist in Miami several years ago who produced an amazing body of work in teaching public safety agencies about understanding about cultural diversity and understanding about Afro-Caribbean religions. And you know, so there's that particular area. As far as my interacting with the Hoodoo culture, you know, as a child raised up in Memphis, we would go down Bill Street, and my folks would take me to A. Schwab, the dry goods store there, and you know, you would see these powders and oils and all these different you know, accoutrements used in the practice of root work, and I was just kind of enamored with it. I didn't really understand what it was, you know. And years later, a friend of mine, his grandmother, who was a root worker, I was introduced to her and spent some time with her, and really learned about the love that many root workers have for their clients, for the people they work with. You know, we hear all these horror stories in whether it's in Hoodoo or whether it's in any kind of spirituality of people who take advantage of people for finances. You know, the lady that I worked with, Miss Jessie, she usually didn't accept money. People would bring her food, people would bring her vegetables out of their garden. She would tell you the work she did was from the divine. And so it was a gift that she gave to be able to help other people. And she loved people. And so it ran very much against the stereotypes that we see in Hollywood of, you know, someone living in a dark, musty house and sticking pins and dolls and, you know, all this kind of stuff. And then another avenue where all these avenues sort of collided was I had been doing some work with an NGO group in Africa. And it was amazing to see a number of practices with the traditional healers and the spiritual churches there that very much mimicked what I saw here in root work and Hoodoo. And, you know, and it was just another confirmation of this cultural survival throughout the years through these different practices. And, you know, when we use the word Hoodoo, I would like to say there are people who recognize various traditions of Hoodoo in different areas of the country that may be influenced by something different, may be influenced by Germanic practices, may be influenced by specific Native American practices. But those here in the Mid-South have appeared to primarily been from a African traditional religious source. And there's definitely a lot of survivals that we can point out in that particular area.
Exceptionally. That's another thing that I found interesting is there was a lot of influences. They came here with their own spiritual practices, but they seemed to be very accepting of other spiritual practice into their own, which I found was quite unique considering like the other examples we have through history. But to go back into Hoodoo a little, I've noticed that there's a little bit of confusion. It's not always like clearly articulated the difference between like Hoodoo, Voodoo, and like Voodoo, because Voodoo is, even though it's very like connected with very negative connotation, the Hollywoodized version of like all of these spiritualities, but like it is still a very legit practice. So I was like wondering if you could like explain like maybe how they're different in a sense.
Sure, you know, and that kind of goes back to the as we talked a little bit earlier, the differences in Hoodoo and Vodou. You know, spirituality takes on a number of different faces in different geographic regions. And in some areas, some things may be more commercialized with a lot of mass marketed retail products associated with it. In some areas, it may be concentrated on more of what your generational lineage is. And so, the different manifestations of African traditional religion here in the States have for lack of a better term, have their own flavors. And, you could go to Little Haiti in Miami and find a forms of Haitian voodoo that is very different than, say, New Orleans voodoo, or very different than Dominican-based voodoo. And again, they just manifested differently in these different geographic regions. And so, again, they typically were, and not even most times the traditional forms, but the Hollywood forms was what hoodoo was typically compared to in the press and by the media.
Yeah, I found that it was a lot of the research that I did, it was hard to like give a staple, concrete, like overall stretching definition of each spirituality practice, because like it was so based on the people who practiced it and if they happened to even be in like a grouped area like Little Haiti or New Orleans. So I found that was just like, it was both like intriguing and almost like it was almost as diverse as the people who practice it in a sense. But final question, just to like kind of wrap this all up, and this is more of a personal one, but you told me a lot of the items that you gave to the exhibit were given to you by practitioners, and I wanted to just kind of ask you, if you're comfortable with it, like how did you begin collecting these objects? Like how did you like begin to like build these relationships with practitioners enough for them to give you some very heavily spiritual items? And like if you could like maybe name one that has like a particular special place in your heart in a sense.
Sure. At the end of the day, whether we're looking at hoodoo or voodoo or any form of spirituality, people are people, and I've always been a people person. I love people. And when I first came to know, say, Miss Jessie, I came to know her as this lovely grandmother, who happened to be a root worker, and through the years, I'm no expert in hoodoo. I don't claim to be an expert in hoodoo. I get people asking me all the time, is this tradition of hoodoo more legit? Is this one more legit? I'm not a practitioner, so I'm not going to call that. But what I do know is that there are stories that have never been told, and there are stories that if we don't document them, they will die with many of the elders that are passing. And in relation to the world around us, when we look at situations like what happened with early root workers, whether it be, being called, devil worshippers in the press, or being arrested. In one case, one particular man outside of Germantown was accused of being a conjurer, and he was murdered. If we don't learn from these stories, and we all have something to learn, regardless of our background, we all have something to learn from these studies, because these are stories of survival, perseverance. They're also stories of how sometimes we look at the world, and because someone is different or someone does something that we're not used to, we look at them and judge them in a certain way. And in many cases, even take action with that. And so I think there's so much to learn from all of this. And that's how I approached practitioners was, I don't want to speak for you. I want to share your story, because it's not my interpretation that's important. It is your voice and being able to be a platform where your voice can speak. And so through the years that, I've been blessed to have some wonderful relationships with different practitioners. I respect them. I love them. I know when some of them, need to buy turkey for Thanksgiving, and we've worked with families that if someone has a son who's in trouble, that they need help financially or something. What I'm getting at with this is practitioners are people just like you and I, and fellow human beings, and we care about them first as human beings. Then if there's some relation to the culture, that's beautiful. We want to share that. As it applies to artifacts now, I think I may have given you some references to Dr. Champion in the exhibit. One of the artifacts that we use that we're blessed to have is a coat that Dr. Champion wore many times while doing consultations. And Dr. Charles Champion, for those of you that don't know him, is an amazing man. He was the first African-American pharmacist in Memphis to work in a retail pharmacy. He went to school at Xavier. He has background in interacting with spiritual workers, root workers, conjurers. He's an amazing person, and he knows how to address spiritual issues as well as physical and biological issues that clients may come to him with. And so that has been a blessing to be able to utilize that and show that when we do our traveling museum.
Let's see, I remember you asking me if I had gotten any approaches from other practitioners about donating, or people who had other objects donating. And I remember saying, I was like, it's very hard to get the trust, and it takes a lot of time, more time than I had, to come and ask somebody like, hey, are you willing to talk to me about something that so a lot of people close so close to their chest, and I think it's for good reason, to be fair, because it's such a stigmatized thing even today. So
Absolutely. I run into two perspectives quite commonly when I'm speaking somewhere on this subject, and this is from non-practitioners. Is some people will go, oh, that's that old superstitious stuff they used to do, but then I've had several times where they'll come up later and go, well, my grandmother, she used to mop the steps with urine. My grandmother used to give us poke root to get rid of this or that sickness. And they'll start describing traditional remedies. And that's another aspect is in the Mid-South, the depth of the culture, it wasn't always called hoodoo. And I've met practitioners through the years who they don't say I'm practicing hoodoo. It's healing, it's remedies, it's approaches to, someone needs help. Well, I know to be spiritual with them. I know to work in the spiritual with them. So it's definitely it's still sort of a tucked in culture. And again, with good reason. Historically, practitioners have been treated horrible through the years. And then too, there's an element of secrecy that's there not to protect anything bad, but just to protect tradition. And so it's considered sacred. And so there's a protection to protect the sacredness of that tradition.
Yeah, I remember you telling me a few, a lot of time the practitioners don't see themselves as practitioners. They're just people who happen to know a thing or two that grandma told them about. So it's just it kind of also, it's a tricky field to to kind of go across, because like if I come up to someone and be like, hey, hello, are you a Hoodoo practitioner? And they're just thinking, no, I don't even identify myself as that.
Right.
So
Right.
I feel like that's even a harder way to like get forward into the situation of like trying to like open up that context of like, hello, can I talk to you about your practice? And they don't even see it like that. It's just a remedy, which is like kind of the complication of folklore in general, is like of how people personally think about it and how it's projected to the world academically, in a way, I guess, to say, in a kind of standard view. But I guess that's all the questions I had. I guess, are we saving all the questions for Tony to the end, Adriana?
Yes, so what we're going to do now, Nicole, if you want to go ahead into your presentation on your exhibition, and then we will have a Q&A session. So whenever you're ready to start your presentation, go ahead.
Okay, give me 1 second to make sure it doesn't fly into the wall, because Zoom is very difficult sometimes.
No worries there.
Okay. Excellent. Everybody can see? Excellent, cool. Okay, so I started this exhibit when Adriana first kind of gave out these internships about curatorial positions, and she wanted to do one based on folklore. And at first, I didn't quite realize the the file that I'd have to shift to get to like what I would eventually end up with. And so, like she said before, the exhibit's called Hoodoo We Do, tracing the origins and practices of hoodoo in the West Tennessee. We thought we would make it something, slick, easy for people to remember. So the one thing I had an issue with originally trying to get this exhibit to be put together is I didn't really have a concrete definition of what folklore is. It's kind of like what Tony was talking about with the definitions of the different practices, like Buddhism, voodoo, and voodoo. It's kind of loose and it's based on like individual translations of the word. But folklore is what we would, once you sit down and think of it, it's what we would probably assume it is. It's traditional creations of people, and it does not have to be complex. Anybody who has a background in ancient history would know that traditions are just something that we can achieve by making sounds, words, and images, or even just belief systems. And I put some examples here because they can be a lullaby that some people will just hum, that they remember their mother humming to them and they'll hum to their children one day. Or it could be like Tony mentioned a lot of remedies that people don't really associate with hoodooism. They just associate it with, this is what mom told me to do when I was sick. Like one of my family favorites is, if you have hiccups, drink a spoonful of vinegar. And so every time I tell people that, they think it's insane, but that would be considered like a remedy. And then there's Wellerisms, which are like quick little phrases that people are commonly will spout out, and of course stories and fables. And this can stretch out though into dances and like events and things like that. So it doesn't have to be really specific on like these, like I said, not limited to these situations. So the most popular example that I have found based on the literature that have been put forward, and the literature stretches back far into like the 18th century, of people trying to like put a firm definition of folklore. The popular example of it is folklore is usually passed down in the form of wisdom and skill and practices from one generation to another. But the thing is, it's very, very unlikely that it was passed down with like a physical tome or reference. I mean, there might be like a journal or something like that, but it's not usually done in like a formal academic standard. Like you don't go to college and learn about the folklore in a standard way that folklore is passed down. So once I had gotten an idea of what folklore was, I had to try to associate it to West Tennessee, which is difficult because folklore is a notoriously difficult field to try to like find information through. Because usually what you get is like you get an oral history or something that someone remembers and they've written down, and it's not always the exact copy of the original piece of folklore. So it's kind of like taking a piece of thread and trying to go through a net to get to the original piece. So I had to like it's always trying to find the original, like where did it sprout from originally, which is not always where you expect it. So trying to find folklore specifically from West Tennessee was difficult because what could have ended up here could have started all the way back in California or Maryland or something, that it was a very convoluted mess that sometimes was hard to sift through, which is kind of the job of what a folklorist does. And Tony would be a great example of what a folklorist would look like, in the sense that he usually kind of he approaches it in the same like scientific, methodical facets of any other cultural field, like anthropology and archaeology, which anthropology is his background. But you would pretty much take this humongous, enormous like library of information, sometimes not even written down, it's sometimes verbal, and you approach it with like a one piece of like ambiguous folklore that doesn't always have attached to it any characters that would be resembling to any specific culture or area. Sometimes it's just a piece of folklore that has no recognizable characteristics to it. So to kind of help themselves with it, folklorists will also try to narrow their field out even more, saying they'll focus on dances or songs or art, or in Tony's case, he's very into religion or spirituality or cultural spirituality. But the problem with this is that folklorists kind of get put down the sense that many museums and academic institutions don't register them as legitimate scholars, worthy of being showcased. And the thing is too, like, they're not that different. It's just that their work is based in what a lot of scholars might have a problem with, and it's based in things that are not always right in front of us. A lot of folklore, as Tony said, is it's fleeting. It's usually in the minds of people who are going to be the last generation to remember it, and it's not for some reason concrete enough to a lot of academics. So for some reason, people can see folklorist is not like a scientific, branch of work, when really it's probably, you have to even be even more methodical to be a folklorist, because you have to take even the barest piece of information and run with it for miles. So folklorists are important because, like again, Tony mentioned, is that they're cultural conservators. But in comparison to like the way an archaeologist would excavate, a folklorist goes, they find that origin, or they find whatever they can to build up the story, the context, the like historical record, and they pretty much come to every person that can tell it to them. It's not always written down. It sometimes has to be shown to them or spoken to them. And for them to finally sit down and methodically and scientifically write it down for future generations is a true like testament to the future generations, who will never probably get to hear it from the original elders or members who were involved with it. So I had to kind of take a little passive role of being a folklorist, but luckily I had Tony to really help me with this project, because it was very almost intimidating to see like there's so much of the history that's in this area alone, but a lot of it leads off into the vast beyond. So there were some amazing things about working with the Hoodooism. One of my favorite things was that Tony and I kind of talked about how we would handle this exhibit, and like what some careful landmines to avoid. And one of them was to always there's always the original respect that you would give an item if you were working in a museum, especially if it comes from a culture that's not yours, or even just any culture period. But the items that were loaned to the museum are either in a very delicate state, they come from an era that's now gone, or they're very like important religious or spiritual items. And and a little funny side note, I remember discussing this exhibit with one of my friends that live in my building, and I remember him telling me to be very careful with how I handled the objects, because not only are some of them fragile physically, but some of them carry in his mind a physical power that requires a certain level of respect and delicate handling. And so like working with Hoodoo kind of set that progress way, like don't handle it like it's just another object, is what I was kind of getting the insinuation of, and which is why I was always careful to handle things respectfully, not just carefully like it was just anything, just respectfully. And I discussed this with Tony as well, because this is another thing that was very important for me, was to make sure I was avoiding the trap of presenting Hoodoo as a gimmick or something flashy. Hoodooism is a beautiful culture or spirituality and a culture that I've barely gotten to scratch the surface of with this exhibit, but it doesn't really require the Hollywoodized things that are thrown onto it to kind of make it more attractive, because it already is a very beautiful culture in religion or practice, whatever someone presents it as in itself, due to the fact that of the people involved into it. As Tony has said before, a lot of people who work in hoodoo are doing it for the sheer joy of the benefit of their communities and their clients, and a lot of them are doing it because they truly believe that they have a gift to share with other people, and that they believe that gift should not be kept to themselves. So if you take away the kind of cliches that are put with hoodooism and you actually present it in its true context, you realize it doesn't really need the gimmickry. So that was something I was really trying to push with this exhibit. I also mentioned this before, is that there's a strong connection to hoodoo that many might not be like aware of, because modern places like Memphis, and Tony mentioned this slightly as well, is that streets like Beale Street were flooded, and pretty much the place to go if you needed a healing or some kind of spiritual help, or like you need some luck or something like that. And like, it's not presented to us that way today. So if you walked on Beale Street, you would have never gotten a sense of that history almost. And you think about if you would see the little clovers everywhere, that these were buildings that were once ran by, I'm forgetting the name real quick, a Lucky Heart, which was a commercial, who commercialized and almost in a way normalized pieces of hoodooism in the world, or in Memphis. So like, people were more familiar with it, and they were also very careful not to make it like a gimmick. They were presenting it as like, these are products that use for healing, not hoodooism. Like, hoodooism isn't essentially a bunch of doesn't always come down to mojo bags or luck spells, but sometimes it's just essentially like trying to do better for those around you and yourself. But extending onto the history as well, I also wanted to lament some of the violence that practitioners face for trying to just be a part of their community, a helpful part of their community. When you go into the museum, you'll see pictures and some references to the almost constant fear and attack that practitioners were under. And it was simply, as have been speaking about, because of the fact that no one understood hoodooism. And of course there was the racial tension, but there was also like a fear of the unknown, of like, what is this practice? I do not understand it, thus I must fear it. And it's something that we still deal with today. Things that we do not understand, or essentially we have a almost knee-jerk reaction to just automatically be afraid of it. And also the fact too that practitioners were easy targets for things that were in the local area were going wrong. If your well went bad, you could easily blame a practitioner dropping a mojo bag down it. So they were like the scapegoats of history. But then you have situations where there are slaves who are great healers being used by their masters to pretty much be used off to their friends for like, hey, you got a headache? My slave can help you. So it's like it's sucking on both sides of their mouth. We fear it, yet when it works for certain people, it's almost respected, because practitioners, like a former slave, can be pretty much sold off as a commodity. Like, hey, you need a root worker? I got you. This is who you come to. So I wanted to kind of lament the almost difficult world that had to be traversed to survive as a practitioner. And that's why I was mentioning before about having to keep it close to chest, because of just the history that they had has not been the best. So the purpose of the exhibit that I wanted to put forward was the practice of hoodoo is not unfamiliar. People fear things that they don't recognize, but if they were to sit down and actually look at some of the common practices of hoodoo, they would find that a lot of them are not unfamiliar. As like we've said before, a lot of them are just simple remedies that have been taught that you and I might have used in our own households, or practices that were taken from Judeo-Christian practices or Native American practices. Like candle burning is not something that is just exclusive to hoodooism. People burn candles all over the world for certain reasons, to help for certain, if it's whether to cleanse an area, to carry a prayer, and then incense. Hoodoo practitioners use incense. This is not something that is kept just to hoodooism. To some people, just to sit down and look at what is in the practitioner's handbag, they would see that they would be familiar with a lot is being used. And what I think gets like accented when it gets Hollywoodized or kind of like demonized is that they want to always show the what people would call grotesque things, but again, if you look at what people might call those grotesque implements in hoodooism, it's sometimes things that are used in just other cultures around the world that are just not very familiar to us. So hoodoo is not unfamiliar, and that's what I tried to go for with this exhibit. And hoodooism had a very heavy hand in the formation of many well-known cities in West Tennessee. African American populations were helped because of hoodooism, because of the commercialization of hoodooism. Companies wanted to give jobs to African Americans while selling products associated with hoodooism because of the fact that they were recognizable almost with one another. And I also, this is the most important thing, is that the practice of hoodoo is legitimate and it's respectable. If you shed any negative connotations with it, it's, like I said, it's familiar. It's got very sound structures to it. It's not something that is just on a whim. Usually it's structured by years of practice and years of tradition and years of listening to your elders and what they've been told and what has been put into practice and what has been shown to be correct and right. So it's not just to scare people is what I want to say. Hoodoo isn't just to scare and terrorize people who are, the normals or anything. It's really not done with what it looks like in mind. It's done to legitimately help people, and that is what people should have in mind when they leave the exhibit. Is hoodooism, despite the trauma it's experienced while entering America, is a very much respectable practice. And the one thing I want to say too, lastly with some final comments, is hoodooism and the practitioners who have it, there might be people who keep their practices close, but they're always, every time I've seen a true depiction of hoodooism written in any kind of scholarly way, the people who have actually talked to practitioners are talking to people who show the true purpose of hoodooism. And it's always like, I'm helping my community. I have this gift that's usually divine in nature, and I'm giving it to other people. So there is no like selfishness. It's not a common theme in this practice. And again, like we said before, they don't typically see themselves as practitioners. They're healers, they're root workers, they're herbalists. They don't usually attach themselves to, I'm a practitioner of hoodooism. And it's almost making you, you'll see some practitioners who broadcast, I think we talked about this, Tony, they broadcast their gifts and things like that. And they shouldn't be demonized any less than someone who you literally, who and you go to their front door and you say, I've got a problem, they help you kind of person. But in the end, this practice was basically, it's grounded in a desperate attempt to carry over the traditions from Africa. And when they got here, they were willing to consume traditions from the cultures around them. And despite the trauma that they have experienced, the result is always the same. They always practice hoodoo to help most of the time. So that's what I wanted to kind of have people leave with on this one, is it's a familiar practice. It's not adverse or anything. It's quite common, has quite common elements to it, and that it's not something to fear, but actually it would be something that someone should be intrigued to explore more, in a sense, because sometimes you get to the tip and it literally is just the tip. There's just so much more in abundance in it all. And I think that's all I got for you today.
Well, very well put, Nicole. Thank you so much for telling us all about the exhibition and this cultural and religious significance of the objects that are in your exhibition. So we might actually, we've got quite a few questions from people, which thank you so much, everybody, for asking questions. So I'm going to go through them, and we'll just go from there. So the first question we have is from Mr. Robert Bear. Is there a single root from which hoodoo, voodoo, and perhaps the Gullah all flow from, a common African ancestral region? Possibly. So what can both of you say on that?
Tony, you go ahead first. You're the
we do see a lot of lineage from the Congo region of Africa. We see a lot in relation to the Congo Minkisi objects becoming what we come to know as the mojo bag. A lot of practices related to what has been called the nation sack, used by females in the Mid-South that were practitioners, and there have been some lineage discovered back to many West African women's societies. And so, we typically see this lineage real heavy from the Congo region, from the Bantu people in the Congo region. And I know as well, we do have some Yoruba influence as well in what we have seen through the years here.
Anything, Nicole, that you wanted to add to that, or?
Oh, no, I just saw that from all my research I had seen on it. It was definitely, a lot of it came from the West African region, for sure.
Excellent, excellent. And so next question from Randy on our Facebook Live. Can you speak to music associated with hoodoo? That's an interesting question. So is there
there's a great lineage of musical history with references to hoodoo, and it's interesting, being raised up in the 80s. There was a time that heavy metal music, that it became the gimmick for bands to associate themselves with some sort of Satanism or witchcraft or some kind of something, and the majority of musicians were just doing that. They were just basically prostituting aesthetics from different religions to sell records. The difference that we saw with a lot of the lyrics pertaining to hoodoo, and particularly in blues music, was that this was speaking of daily life. My black cat bone was something that the musician carried, or singing about a woman named Aunt Carolyn Dye, who lived over across the bridge in Arkansas, was a reference from someone who had experiences with this traditional healer. So yeah, there is some tremendous references to hoodoo in a lot of the Memphis blues and a lot of the Delta blues in general. And it's fantastic. Just a demonstration of what daily life was like for a lot of folks in relation to the respect for hoodoo and the practice.
I saw a lot, and I was looking, because I did stop to look at the music for a second because it is very interesting. But there was an article I was reading that they were associating a lot of the music made in the blues industry was not really geared for, they were arguing that it wasn't geared for the vast majority, like a lot of people would assume music was for. They definitely were thinking of a specific audience when they did, and because like there was like this revolutionary where like there was the blues music for African Americans in a sense, like there was blues music for the Caucasian population, and then there was a blues music for the mixed population. But then like people said that music that focused on hoodoo would definitely be geared to the African American population who would recognize some of the elements being spoken of, even if they weren't practitioners.
Awesome, awesome. So next question from Beverly saying, awesome presentation and thank you, Professor Kale, for your research. Quick question, can you talk a bit about the relationship between Hoodooism and syncretic influences from Christianity, Islam, and other faiths or belief systems in Santeria? I'd love to know about Caribbean connections with Hispaniola, especially Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the connection between honoring ancestors and remembering the past and seeking intercession in the presentation and for the future regarding protection, prosperity, good relationships, and good health.
That's a great question. You know, we see this lineage, and while we see African traditional religion, at one point in history, we see on a number of plantations where Christianity comes into the picture. You find incidences with slave owners who forced the practices of their preferred religion onto slaves. And so you saw in some cases this bringing together of these two. And you know, I always refer to a lady I met in Africa several years ago who, when I entered her hut, she had a shrine to a African traditional religious tradition locally, and then she also had pictures of Jesus on the wall. And I asked her through my translator at the time, I said, you know, so where is she coming from with this? And the answer was essentially whatever works. That these were branches of spirituality that provided something for her, and so this is what she took in. You know, we find in the history of hoodoo the introduction of the Psalms to practitioners being a really powerful thing that's still celebrated today, and the use of the Psalms in spiritual workings. And there are elements that we've seen through the years in relation to different religions and how they affect the practices of hoodoo and the different, I guess, mechanisms in this practice that do come from different areas that do have a Islamic influence, a Christian influence. And then we also see, you know, as we spoke of earlier, in relation to ancestors. In African traditional religion, ancestor veneration, and I don't like using the word ancestor worship necessarily, because I think that's been used in a negative way in some facets, but ancestor veneration, understanding that the ancestors, the elders, hold tribal wisdom, and that they are the ones that you seek wisdom from, because they've been here, they know, you know. And so that ancestor veneration through different African traditional religious practices, be it Santeria, be it Voodoo, or be it practices related to Hoodoo, you know, is pretty consistent through there.
All right, awesome. Next question is from Dr. Rebecca Howard. So where are any, and there's actually, it's a two-part question, but I'll give the first one, I'll go ahead with that. Were there any time correlations between this police persecution of Hoodoo practitioners and perceived Hoodoo practitioners and the Jim Crow era? Like, did the period amplify things?
That's a good question. You know, we saw a lot of the recorded incidents of violence in the mid to late 1800s. I think the murder outside Germantown was about 1862. Later on, we started seeing raids on settlements in Memphis. And this is where there were a lot of recorded incidents of root workers and practitioners being, arrested and sort of made public examples by police in that time frame. We know that later on through the years in the 60s, there was a heavy amount of arrest where a lot of traditional healers were arrested on charges of practicing medicine without a license. This was a really hot one that was pursued frequently here in the Mid-South with traditional healers.
Okay. And so Dr. Howard's second question is, Tony, you just building off the previous question and your comment on the person murdered because he was believed to be a conjurer, I'm just curious about the time frames. I think we like to believe that this type of persecution is tied to like the Salem witch trials centuries in the past, but this sort of thing still happens every day. I guess my question is, do you still hear about such things happening in the present? I wouldn't be surprised at all if that is the case, sadly.
We have through the years heard of different situations, and there for a time I would be called when there would be a homicide investigation, and there would be different materials related to spiritual practices found in the home of the victim. And so I can't say that in all these situations that the person was particularly targeted for because of their role as a healer, but we have heard of situations like that do exist.
And Ms. Chandler Tate asks both of you, can you give me some examples of healing practices used in Hoodoo? Great question.
Nicole, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I actually had seen a lot of them. So when they got commercialized, it was actually a lot, from what I had read, simpler to initiate some of the practices of Hoodoo. Like some of the powders that they were giving off, they were basically, instead of going out and having to get your own ingredients, you could go to a store and buy them. And there could be powders that could be made into teas. You could get some Hai John root, which is which is really popular to help with some healing problems. But one of my favorites ones to this day is still using the mercury dime on a red thread was a way to help with getting away bad energies, but also to heal any problems that you might have at the time. Also carrying a little bag of nutmeg, which is like, I think the picture that I showed at the end was a practitioner who had a bag of nutmeg. But pretty much the practices that were used were herbal in essence. So like people would initiate at a first level, like pretty much teas or something that you would wear to help get rid of injuries or ailments that you had. A lot of practitioners themselves would wear things like the mercury dime, which is just a dime made early on around a red thread to help get rid of ailments they had themselves. So it wasn't always the more elaborate practices where sometimes they would bring you in and you would have to go through almost like a ceremony in essence from what I've read, but most of the time they would give you something like a bag, kind of like a mojo bag where you would have to feed it whiskey, and there would be certain elements inside that would be like a piece of roots, something to attract the healing and things like that. I don't know if Tony wants to elaborate on that.
Yeah, a lot of the healing techniques ranged from spiritual readings to sort of assess what may be going on in a client's life, to praying, to laying on of hands, to prescribing different herbal remedies. In some cases, particularly when we started to see the formation of some of the spiritual churches, you would actually have elements related to almost trance. Where someone would act as a medium to the spirits, to the ancestors, and so a number of different healing techniques being utilized.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so next question is from Mr. Sean Pitts. To what extent have root workers been scrutinized or under pressure to give up their work by the medical community? That's a very interesting question, actually.
You know, that's a great question. We found that at one point, because Bill Street in its earliest conception was Robert Church wanted Bill Street to be the main street for Black America, and so you had Black-owned businesses, you had culture, whether it be music, whether it be dance, whether it be food, that was primarily for the African American community because there was usually nowhere else to go to be able to enjoy all of that. So Church built Bill Street in that. Once the heyday of root workers on Bill really came, because you'd find, classic root workers, classic conjurers like Dr. Scissors, Big Mama Strickland, healers like her. We started seeing locally in Memphis the medical community complaining that they were actually losing patients to Bill Street because patients were going to Bill to receive healing. We saw in Nashville, actually, an organization in Nashville pushed for like the Tennessee Board of Health to write almost a public announcement regarding the fruitlessness of utilizing root work and hoodoo. So it very much was reacted on by what would be considered the mainstream medical community.
Very interesting. So there's another question from Angela Smith. I wonder about the African tradition or traditional religious cosmologies that may influence how hoodoo showed up in the Mid-South, especially in Tennessee. Are either of you aware of which enslaved African ethnic groups had the largest Congo, etc., presence in the Mid-South?
I think one of the things that we saw is when slaves were being brought from areas like Virginia to the Delta and then sort of moved from there, is we saw a heavy presence of Congo-based, of Yoruba-based practices. And again, it seems that a lot of the Congo-based traditions are really seen heavily throughout the Mid-South hoodoo culture. And again, this is that survival of these spiritual traditions.
Awesome. And Angela, just to let you know, the exhibition will be in the museum until January 3rd. I would love to do another Curator's Corner video on the exhibition in general and some of the objects that are in there, but I highly suggest if you are able to, definitely come visit us. It's definitely worth seeing in person. So just to answer that question about viewing it virtually. Another question from Dr. Howard, do the majority of the objects in the exhibit come from Tony's personal collection? Who else / what other institutions allow the center to borrow the items? I'll let Nicole's probably the first one to start with that question.
So like I said, I actually started to ask around because I was interested in this topic personally because of the fact that I do like the metaphysical in my own personal practices. So I was aware with some of the metaphysical area, like stores around me that do hold hoodooism items. So I even started going in there and asking. I was like, do you know anybody that would like to talk to me about hoodoo? And the look of tense jaw kind of told me that it might not be a question to ask. So I definitely was very lucky to get Tony when I did, because I was getting a little hopeless with the fact that it's hard to come up to somebody and ask them for something that is so spiritual and connected to their practice. And it's hard to keep track of something that people were actively trying to destroy as well. So I mean, when I found out about Tony, I was happy, but the thing is too that I was also surprised there wasn't more objects in the sense of like in the other museums or even some of what the folklore society. That's the first place I looked, and the most they had were more musical based, and they had essays about people, like documentation of people talking to practitioners. But the aspect of having actual objects, I either was not, my first like initial contact with them was either not like they never got back to me, or I was kind of given the opinion that they didn't have things like that there. So I was just, it was kind of like a kind of, to the moment I was like frantic, like, where am I going to get objects when either no one wants to share? It's not really something that you share in a museum, and also there's this snobby opinion that you just don't have them in a museum, and I'm like, it was getting a little nerve-wracking. But yes, Tony's museum, the traveling museum, was the only one that was actually willing to let us borrow these objects, because I think Tony explained it well. A lot of the objects that were given to him, I think, were given to him to actually educate and to show what true hoodooism looks like. So I don't know if Tony wants to expand on that.
Yeah, the objects come from just a number of sources through the years. I would find sources where someone who even worked at one of the mass production companies in Memphis was surprised that anybody was even interested in some of the objects that they had. And again, it's not something that you see or ask about every day. And it is our hope that these objects are used to preserve and document and share these histories. And so when Nicole and I first met, I for lack of a better term, I sort of needed to feel her out to make sure her objectives were going to be respected, which they very much are. But my fear was that some of these objects would be utilized. We've seen, unfortunately, how a lot of things have been used to either basically make money somewhere, or exploit, or put really biased slants on things. And so we definitely just wanted to be aware of how it was going to be presented. And the center and Nicole shared where they were coming from, and I felt like they really got the vibe and understood what our purpose was in sharing this.
Awesome. So next question is, let's see, for another question from Robert Bear. There is a Gullah belief in what is called a boo hag, and it is to rid your home of them and similar spirits. You can either line your walls with newspaper and sometimes use bottle trees to capture them. I recently got to examine a home that was being torn down from the turn of the century, and its walls were covered in newspaper. So I'm curious if there is a Mid-South version of boo hag, or a similar spirit.
Yeah, that is a great example. I appreciate you sharing that. One of the common elements, in fact, it's funny, I was talking to a gentleman today whose family spoke about this belief, is the belief in the hags, and more in the belief of in what was termed around here as haints. Miss Jessie would tell me that after a certain period of night, if you heard something outside, make sure the door was closed and locked, because there's haints out there. And we see this through a number of different cultures, this fear of these elements, that almost witch type spirits and malevolent type spirits. And we can still with in Mid-South Hoodoo, we can see culturally a lineage of African worldviews regarding the spiritual realm, and regarding the fear of witches in the sorcery sense, as being a real threat. And so we definitely we see it more in the view of haints as opposed to boo hags. But yeah, I know the boo hags very much heavy in the Carolinas, and I've seen some tremendous research on that before.
Awesome. That sounds very neat. Last question for tonight from Jean Ashmore. I had a personal experience in the 1960s. I had a nosebleed, and an African-American woman close to our family did 3 things to stop the nosebleed. She tied a house key to a string and dropped it down the back of my shirt. She poured salt on top of my head, and she tore a brown paper bag and threw the pieces in my face. Comments or thoughts? By the way, the nosebleed stopped, which I'm very happy to hear that, Jean. That's good.
Nice. These are, to say I understand the exact symbolism of that working, I can't. But what we do see in a lot of situations is the observation of 2 practices in magic, and that's the law of contact and the law of similarity. When something's placed against you, it has the ability to remove something, or if it looks like somebody, if you come to me and you say, my child is sick, and a healer may say, well, bring me a picture of your child, and we will do this working, and because the picture looks like your child, it will affect your child, and that works on the law of similarity. The law of contact we see with things that are in contact with someone will still affect them. So if someone's sick, you may say, hey, bring me a garment of their clothing, or different avenues like that. But the healer that Jean interacted with, and so good to hear from you, Jean, that particular healer may have been utilizing the key to remove whatever it was on Jean and bothering Jean as far as the nosebleed. And the salt is typically used in purifying and keeping away evil. And so, that may have been sort of a dispersal of something she felt was negative on Jean.
I do know personally that keys are known to do sometimes it depends on what kind of key, but keys can be known to dispel energy, dispel negative energies. Like sometimes the silver or the iron in the key can help dispel it. Like if you have an old traditional key, it can't be like a house key. Usually it has to be like one of those old ones that are elaborate and ornate. So I've heard that might have been why she might have put it down your back, because you have a lot of lifelines and points in your spine as well that might have been why she had done it as well.
Awesome. Well, that wraps it up for the Q&A section. I just want to say I can't even express how thankful I am to both Tony Kale and to Nicole Gregory for facilitating this talk. Nicole, you did an amazing job with your exhibition, and Tony, we couldn't have done it without all of your help and research and insight on Hoodoo in West Tennessee. So thank you both so much for helping us with this event. And thank you to everybody that came with probably the best questions I've ever heard in any sort of talk series. These were some awesome questions. So thank you everybody for participating. And so from the West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center, we wish you all a very safe and happy night and a great holiday weekend with Halloween coming. So thank you everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.